Hi, this is for Percussion Ensemble. This is a quick lecture on our composition project and on the piece that we're sort of using as the inspiration for the composition project for this semester. That piece is Double Music by John Cage and Lou Harrison. It's from 1941. If you know your percussion ensemble history, you know that it was 1929 when Edgar Varese wrote a piece called Ionization, which is kind of widely considered to be the first piece for percussion ensemble, even though in other cultures, ensembles of percussion instruments have been making music together for a long, long, long time. And kind of the Western classical composer, Western notation, performer, classical tradition, Ionization from 1929 is one of the first pieces. So you can see that double music is written in 1941. You can see that we're still relatively early in that history. By this point in time, John Cage and Lou Harrison, along with Henry Cowell, are really important figures in the West Coast percussion ensemble movement, working all up and down between LA, San Francisco, and also up towards Washington State at the Cornish School in Seattle, Washington, etc. But anyway, uh, in the piece, the piece is composed in an interesting way because parts 1 and 3 of the quartet were written by Cage, and parts 2 and 4 of the quartet were written by Harrison. And the parts were written sort of separately. They did this as an experiment. It's interesting because within a couple months after this piece was premiered, Cage ended up moving to Chicago to go teach at the Chicago School of Design, I believe it was. And so there actually was some distance in between Cage and Harrison for a few years after they premiered this piece, but they did it as an experiment. And again, the parts were composed independently and only combined in rehearsal and performance. And so in this environment, that actually is an interesting model for the way a lot of us are working right now, where we're not able to spend time or at least spend long periods of time working in person with people. And so what we're going to be doing in Percussion Ensemble this semester, rather than playing conventional repertoires, we're going to generate some repertoire, and we're going to generate it on this double music model. Now, as we begin talking about this, for a compositional process like this to work, there are things that the collaborating composers, before they start writing, would really have to agree on. If you simply sent two people into a room and said, you compose one part for a piece and you compose another part for a piece, you could see how things could go wrong if they didn't take the time to agree on some basic things beforehand. In addition, the composers could also choose to agree on things, things that aren't necessarily required for the success of the project, but they can make aesthetic choices together before going their separate ways, composing the parts and coming back. And then there's also information that the composers can choose to disclose to each other, not necessarily agreements that they make, but you can certainly say, okay, I don't know what you're going to do, but I'm going to go do this other thing, and I want you to know that I'm going to do this thing. And so going through those parameters before anyone starts to compose anything is going to be useful. Now, what are some things that Cage and Harrison would have had to agree on before they started writing? These things logistically are pretty obvious, but it makes sense to go through them. Cage and Harrison would have to agree on a meter for the piece. And in the case of double music, they agreed to write in 4/4 time. They also would need to agree on how long the piece is. And here they agreed to write a piece that was 200 measures long. So they agreed 200 measures of 4/4 time. And if they don't make that kind of agreement, it's pretty hard to see how this project could be successful in the way they wanted it to be. Now, in addition to those things that they needed to agree on, they chose to agree on some other things. They chose to agree on instrument characteristics. Now, every instrument in double music is some kind of metal. There are bells, there are gongs, there are temple bowls, there are brake drums, there are cowbells, there's a water gong, there's a thunder sheet, but they're all metal. And it's possible that Cage and Harrison, it could have come to that by coincidence, but I think it's much more likely that they said, and we're going to write for a bunch of metal. And so if you want to choose to discuss this with your composing partner and decide, okay, we're going to make a piece for all drums, or I'm going to write the drum part and you're going to write parts for metal or wood, or we're both going to write for found objects, you can have that conversation before you start composing independently. Cage and Harrison also, it appears, came up with an agreement on what the general dynamics and character of the piece was. It's not that the piece doesn't have dynamics written at all, but there's no part that contains a big slow crescendo or a big slow decrescendo. There aren't those kinds of structural volume changes. The piece really is this sort of ongoing single festive whole that changes texture and changes dynamics some, but doesn't have, like I said, big dramatic dynamic changes where all of a sudden things get loud all at once or quiet all at once. And also Cage and Harrison made an agreement on the pitch relationship between the four parts. They agreed that the four parts would be 1, 2, 3, 4, soprano, alto, tenor, bass. So the material in part 1 would generally be the highest material that's happening in the texture. Whatever's going on in part 4 would generally be the lowest pitched or the lowest register sounds happening in the texture at any point. And so Cage ended up writing 1 and 3, so the soprano and the tenor parts, and Harrison wrote the alto and the bass part. So again, those are the kinds of agreements that you can make if you want to. You don't have to, but you can talk about those things as you begin planning. Lastly, what kinds of things might Cage and Harrison have chosen to disclose to each other before starting to write? Now, it's possible, this is pretty highly speculative on my part, it's possible that Cage told Harrison that he was going to be writing his parts with regard to a particular rhythmic structure. And I'm going to talk about that structure in detail in a little bit. It's called square root form. It's a pretty cool way of organizing time that is completely independent from the way most Western classical music organizes time. Most Western classical music organizes time with according to principles of harmony and pitch logic, rather than actually taking a chunk of time and dividing it up in a cogent way on its own without regard to pitch. It's possible Cage and Harrison explicitly coordinated that, but it's also possible that Cage and Harrison just had an idea what the other person was going to do. You know, Lou Harrison knew that John Cage was writing every piece of music he was writing at this point in time using this square root idea, and could have had an idea that, oh, well, John Cage is going to do this again in this piece. And Cage would have had an idea of what kind of music Harrison would have written. And so even without discussing these things, each of them would have had a rough idea of what the other one was likely to do. And that's why I say this is kind of a speculative observation. But again, you know, in this project, you're going to be able to choose how much information you do and don't share with your composition colleague as you work this piece out. And pre-gaming and pre-planning those kinds of agreements and disclosures can go a long way towards making this project successful. Now, that square root structure itself. And I'm going to go into, excuse me, I'm going to go into some detail on this because in one of the pieces that you collaboratively compose, at least one of the parts must be organized according to a square root structure. That's a requirement that I'm putting on the project, but working with this kind of form is very, very interesting, and it certainly is one way to get you thinking structurally and in large scale forms and structures. Excuse me. Separate from the ones you might be more familiar with, like the structure of a pop song and something you could fall into very easily, or the structure of another piece of music that you happen to like. Now, this square root structure, again, it was used extensively by Cage. Once he came up with it, you could almost say almost universally by Cage in his works up through the early 1950s. So his earliest pieces from the mid 1930s, and then for 15, 17 years, up until he starts using chants to compose in, say, 433 and pieces like that in the early 1950s. Now, the square root structure, the basic idea is that it relies on self-similarity. And what that means is that the proportions and divisions of time that exist across the entire piece are the same proportions that exist in each of the smaller parts. The structure of the smaller sections of the piece is the same as the structure of the entire piece. If you're familiar with the mathematical phenomenon of fractals, this is the same kind of idea. The idea that you have some kind of complex shape, and as you zoom in on a part of that complex shape, you find that it reproduces its totality again as you zoom in smaller and smaller and smaller. These kinds of relationships exist in, I mean, and if you want to fire up the internet, you can Google Cantor dust or Sierpinski gasket, or any kind of fractal like that. The Mandelbrot set is a fractal that is self-similar in this way, and you can check that out online to your heart's content. But using simpler mathematical ideas than the Mandelbrot set, the basics of square root structure are this. You take a certain amount of musical time that can be expressed as a perfect square. So a number of measures that is a perfect square. 25 is 5 times 5. So what are your integer perfect squares? There's 1, there's 4, there's 9, 16, 25, 36, 7 times 7 is 49, 8 times 8 is 64, and so on and so on and so on. So for this example, not the double music example, but just for an imaginary example here, I'm saying let's say you chose to write a piece that was 25 measures long. And so in that 25 measure piece, you would have 5 sections of 5 measures each. So your 25 measure piece has 5 parts. They're all the same length, 5 sections, and each of those are 5 measures each. And then furthermore, you'd take the square root, in this case it's 5, and you would break that up into the sum of smaller numbers. And in the case of 5, you don't have so many options. You could do 1 plus 4, 2 plus 3, 3 plus 2, or 4 plus 1 for the sake of our exercise here. I chose 3 plus 2. So once you make those determinations, what you can do is then spin out the entire structure of the piece just from those 2 decisions. And I express those decisions here by saying, in our example, a square root structure that is 5 times 5 measures long, and where 3 plus 2 are the numbers that equal 5. So what this means is that each of those small 5 measure sections, consists of a 3 measure phrase and then a 2 measure phrase. So each of those 5 small parts is 3 plus 2, 3 plus 2, 3 plus 2, 3 plus 2, 3 plus 2. And that the piece itself also has 2 large parts, that the first 3 5 measure sections, the first 15 measures of the piece are kind of your large A section. It's 15 measures long. And then the last 10 measures are a slightly smaller B section that's 10 measures long. So everything is in 5 unit phrases that break down into 3 plus 2, whether you're talking about the measures in the entire piece or the measures in each of your 5 subsections. Now you can't, and sorry, this is just a quick graphical representation of that. So again, part A is the first section, 3 plus 2, the second section, 3 measures plus 2 measures, 3 measures plus 2 measures, and then part B of the piece consists of 3 measures plus 2 measures, and then 3 measures plus 2 measures. And here are your 3 sections, and here are your last 2 sections. And so, and again, at both the micro and macro level, the piece has the same structural proportions. So what this means is that once you choose these numbers, what you know is that in your 25 measure piece, that the downbeat of measure 16, which is the first measure of this part B, that something structurally should change, something audibly should change, that's an important time point in the piece, and so on and so forth. Now, if you really plan this out, if you really plan this out, you can replicate this structure again, this 5 times 5, 3 plus 2 structure again, by dividing each 3 measure phrase into a further 3 plus 2, and then each 2 measure phrase into a 3 plus 2. The easiest way to do this would be to choose to write in 5/4, or some time signature where each measure has 5 of something. And what this would mean is that your let's say 5/4, your 3 measure phrase would consist of 15 quarter notes, which means if you break those 15 quarter notes into 3/5 and 2/5, that you then have a, a subphrase that's 9 quarter notes long and then 6 quarter notes long. And then for every 2 measure phrase, which is 10 quarter notes long, that proportion breaks down into 6 quarter notes and 4 quarter notes. That's a level of complexity and self-similarity that Cage himself doesn't even get to in a lot of his pieces. He does it sometimes. It's strictly optional here, but you should know that because this is a self-similar structure, you can continue to replicate it down from sort of the global everything to the large sections, to the small sections, to the phrases, to the notes, down to whatever microscopic level of musical precision you feel comfortable dealing with. In terms of what I'm requiring, I'm requiring that you simply work on those 2 biggest levels, that the entire piece have a temporal structure that is reflected in each of the subparts at the next level down. Okay. Now, you'll recall that double music is 200 measures long. 200 is not a perfect square. And so what Cage did to apply this structure is he took those 200 measures and said, well, the nearest perfect square is 196. That's 14 times 14. And then that leaves 4 measures left over. You can put them at the beginning or the middle or the end. Structurally, Cage decided that those extra 4 measures were going to be a coda, so that the 196, 14 sections of 14 measures each, plus those 4 measures that are left over as kind of a remainder. That's how he's going to get to 200 measures. And that he's going to divide that 14 up into 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 5. So you can see 4 plus 3 is 7, 2 plus 5 is 7. So it's kind of a 7 plus 7, but those 2 sevens are broken up differently. 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 5. Let's talk quickly about how that manifests. Now you can see the score is here. I'm going to scroll down. This PDF is going to be up on Canvas, so you can look at it to your heart's content. I'm going to scroll down to the part for percussion 3, because that's the part where really all of this happens. That's percussion 2. All of this happens most clearly. There's the least amount of activity in this part, and so you can see relatively quickly what's going on. Now, what this means is that of your 14 measure sections, so the first 14 measure section is going to start on measure 1. The second one is going to start on measure 15, and then you just keep adding 14 and discover that each new section starts on this measure number, 15, 29, 29 plus 14 is 43, 43 plus 14 is 57, and so on and so forth, until you get to, this is a typo, sorry, not 196, until you get to the beginning of measure 197. Thank you for making that mistake. 197 is going to be the beginning of those last 4 measures that form the coda. Now, when I talk about composing in a way that structurally reflects this, let's take a look at this part. Now, the percussion 3 part for double music is written for 3 Japanese temple gongs. These are bowl-shaped gongs that are rubbed with a stick around their edge, and they hum when you do that. So once you get them going, they can make this very smooth, continuous sound. And as you can see from the music, this goes on for quite some time. There's also a tam-tam part, and Cage specifies that those tam-tam notes are played sometimes at the edge, sometimes at the center. The dynamic changes depending. And then as you scroll further down the part, you'll see that there's these parts for cowbells. Cowbells come in here, and then player 3 plays once they start here, mostly cowbells through the end of the piece with some additional tam-tam notes. Now, if we take a look at these 14 measure sections and see what happens, you'll see that tons of important musical events happen at the beginning of these 14 measure segments. So at the beginning of the piece, measure 1, temple gong number 1 is playing, and it plays for quite some time. But if you look to see where it stops, you can see it stops here at the end of measure 28, and that at the beginning of measure 29, there are rests. The temple gong does not play. That's not by accident. So the temple gong number 1, the lowest pitched one, plays for the first 2 14 measure segments, and then there's a rest. And then temple gong number 2, the middle of the 3 in terms of pitch, starts playing on the downbeat of measure 43. Again, the beginning of this fourth 14 measure section. This is not by accident. This kind of logic really, again, it drives the way Cage composed all of the parts for this piece. So temple gong number 2 starts at the beginning of measure 43, continues through 57, and stops on the downbeat of measure 71. And then there's another 14 measure break where there's silence, and then the highest pitched temple gong picks up at the beginning of measure 85. And so we've gotten through our first seven sections of the piece, and the temple gong kind of serves as this background hum in a pattern where it exists in the first section and the second section, so 2 sections, and then there's a 1 section break, and then there's 2 sections of temple gong again and another 1 section break, and then the third temple gong is at measure 85. So those starting and stopping points, they're not accidental at all. They fit right into this 14 measure structure idea. Now, 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 5 means that something structural, if you have something big and structural, it should happen at one of those breaks between the first 4 sections and then the 3 or the 2 or the 5. Now, something very, very musically important happens on the downbeat of measure 99. The first 14 bar section of this group of 2, and it's an instrument we haven't heard before. This is a hallmark of good percussion writing, whether it's for solo or for ensemble, that, you know, one effective way to maintain interest throughout an entire piece is to save sounds for part way through or for near the end. Because so much of percussion is about tone, color, and timbre. If you make all the sounds you're capable of making in the first minute of a 15-minute piece, you have this huge problem of maintaining people's interest as time goes on. And so this is a way of Cage to structurally say, okay, so I've got whoever's performing this is going to have cowbells in their setup. But we're not going to hear them for a while. We're not going to hear them until halfway through, until this very important structural point in the piece, in this square root structure that I developed. And so downbeat of measure 99, we have the first cowbell entrance. And that cowbell entrance continues up through, it looks like the end of measure 108. There's a 5 measure rest, and then another 14 measures of temple gong starting on measure 113. That continues through, and then from 127 to the end, again, 127 is the beginning of that last section of 5 14 bar sections. So again, measure 127 is an important structural point, and you can see that beginning at measure 127 going all the way through to the end, that it's basically all cowbells. If you were waiting, I'm gonna make the joke, if you were waiting for more cowbell, you get it at measure 127. And so you can see how this whole idea of 14 measure phrases governs a lot of the big decisions that Cage makes, and it really helps him deploy all the sounds that he has in an interesting way, where he doesn't have to sit there and rack his brain over sort of artistic ideas about, what would be the most effective, what would be the most useful way to do this. You can decide on a mathematical structure and then fill it up with sound in a way that makes sense. And then again, just a couple quick details. So once the Cowbell Fest starts at measure 127, you see a lot of figures that have occurred earlier in the piece. At measure 141, you see a new cowbell figure that Cage had never used before. So at the beginning of this new 14 measure phrase, he uses this 7-note ascending figure playing all 6 cowbells rising in pitch and then all of a sudden falling back down to the beginning again. It's the first time he uses this figure in this part. It's not an accident that it happens on measure 141. Same thing at measure 169. This figure right here, this 3 rising notes, 3 rising notes, 3 rising notes, doesn't appear terribly off. I don't think it appears anywhere else previously. So again, if you're going to introduce new material, these points are a really good way to do it. And then the 4-measure coda from measure 197, you can see it's got 2 tam-tam hits right there to mark where that happens. Okay. Now, as far as this 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 5 sequence goes, I want to bring your attention to the individual tam-tam notes that you see at the beginning. If you hear this piece or play this piece, one of the real hallmarks of it are these pairs of tam-tam notes where the player strikes the edge and then the middle. They recur throughout the piece, not at perfectly regular intervals. There are some places where they don't happen, but you'll see that, again, it falls into this structure. So 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 5. So inside a single 14 measure phrase, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So the first phrase ends where the mouse arrow is. And you'll see that the first 4 plus 3 measures, the first 7 measures are just temple gong. The beginning of the 2-measure subsection is marked with a tam-tam note at the edge. And then the beginning of the 5-measure phrase is marked with the tam-tam note in the middle. If we start at 11, 12, 13, 14, if we start counting from measure 15, we'll see that the same pattern happens over the next 14 measures. So here's measure 1, 2, measure 3, measure 4, measure 1, 2, 3, and then measure 1, measure 2, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Same pattern. We start on measure 29. Here's first measure, second measure, third measure, fourth measure, first measure, second measure, third measure. At the beginning of the group of 2, there's a tam-tam hit, first measure, second measure, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And by the time you come back around to the top of the cycle, excuse me, the Japanese temple gong is starting again, rinse and repeat all the way through. So the way you set up this number system, you can use this in a whole bunch of really interesting ways to create these recurring elements that bring a sense of structure and unity to the piece without having to get too far into the weeds. It just becomes pretty simple arithmetic in terms of how you put it together. A couple of final points that I want to make, and again, we'll be talking more in various ways before you actually start composing, before we actually determine collaboration partners and start composing. But notice, as you look through the score, parts 1, 2, 3, 4, that Cage and Harrison both did a really remarkable job of leaving space. Player 4 doesn't even play at the beginning. Harrison knew that he had written something for player 2 to do at the beginning, and the chances that players 1 and 3 would be sitting silent at the beginning was pretty low. And so he decided, okay, so player number 4 is going to take some silence. But as you keep scrolling through, you can see there continues to be silent passages. Sometimes those silences coincide, and the kinds of coincidences that you have in pieces like this are can be really interesting. That for some reason, at the beginning of measure 29, both Cage and Harrison give their players a period of silence. Uh, there's one spot where a player actually has a solo, and that kind of decision can take a certain amount of courage. I want to find it now. Sorry. Um, yeah, sorry. So it's not a solo, but if you look here at measure 111, 12, 13, at the downbeat of measure 115, Lou Harrison decided that both of his players were going to be silent for 9.5 measures. And Harrison was confident that Cage would have his players doing something. I don't think Cage takes too many similar breaks in both of his parts. You can go through the score and find out. But you can see that, each of these composers realized that at any given moment, they're only writing half of the music that's going to exist. So you can see throughout this piece, they're both really, really cognizant of making sure that they're leaving room for other people to do other things. Um, so that's a quick introduction to double music. That's a quick introduction to square root form. Again, if you have any questions, there will be a discussion group in this module in Canvas for people to ask those questions collectively. You can also reach out to me through the Canvas inbox or through email or to get whatever you need. Thanks so much. We'll talk more soon.